Hello, good afternoon. Thank you for having me here. I'm so glad that I came after the good presentation by Monica related to biodiversity and its interconnections with the climate crisis, as well as introducing systems thinking, because I think much of the struggle that we are facing right now is because we are currently bound to work, play, and live our lives in a broken system. And it's exactly that kind of broken system that needs to be fixed. And my presentation today would focus on finding an aspect of that broken system that we can do some interventions as individuals and as a collective towards making the world in a way more sustainable but also more just. So my topic would be focusing on finance, finance campaigning, and how it will help us end the era of fossil fuels. Um, and maybe before I do that, I'd like to introduce my organization. My organization is 350.org. Basically, it's a global yet grassroots climate movement that works for one thing. The goal is we want our world leaders and leaders in the corporate sphere to act according to the realities of science, but are also guided by the principles of justice when responding to the climate crisis. We are working that's focused on enabling the power of ordinary people to seize their future. So we want a just and prosperous and equitable future that's built by power of you and me, ordinary people. And the reason why our name is 350, because we're focused on reducing the amount of carbon dioxide in our atmosphere from its current level of 400 parts per million to below 350 parts per million. 350 parts per million was one of the most significant figures that relates to climate science, because according to scientists, that's the safe number of carbon dioxide in our atmosphere that would in a way enable life not just to survive but actually to thrive in its diversity. And basically what I'll be sharing here is much of the experience of 350 Filipinas. I currently serve as part of the regional team of 350, but a function that I also serve is I also work in the organizing side of things for the Philippines. And 350 Pinas basically serves as a support base for the global climate movement in the Philippines. We support community resistance and initiatives through several aspects of advocacy work. One is digital activism, where we provide trainings, the infrastructure, tools, and amplification of local campaigns through our platforms. We provide media and communication support for local activists and organizations. Um, we enable other organizations and communities to hold protest actions that would be able to make it more strategic for their campaigns. So we do the logistics work for them. And then we also provide trainings and skill shares on different aspects of climate campaigning, such as the one that we are doing now related to finance. So that's it for introductions. And maybe I'll start with how do we understand finance? I think a good starting point is we look into ourselves. Think about yourself in the photo. And I'd have to say you're pretty awesome, and you really are. And then think about all the people who have given you money. It could be your boss who paid you for your work. It could be your parents who are giving you your allowance. It could be friends who are giving you stuff or are treating you with meals. So in a way, there's a transaction that money goes to you because someone else gave it to you in exchange for something that you did, or they are just gracious that they are generous that they give you money. Um, and then think of all the people and the business that you loaned, or you like your friend wanted to borrow money, so you loaned it to them. You wanted to buy something, so you pay for it at the store. So that's you giving money outside. Uh, beyond yourself. And in a way, you can also think about it that how many of those people whom you give money to, or people who give you money, give money to each other. Um, One thing I can say about this is that we live in a complex financial web. There are multiple transactions that are happening related to money that is happening around us, and in a way affects us, but in a way we are also involved. And the same is true for fossil fuel companies too. Um, if you replace yourself with a fossil fuel project, let's say a coal plant, where does a fossil fuel company get their money from? It gets its money from on several places. Some institutions like schools, churches, pensions, stockhold, they invest their money on certain projects where they would profit. So that's called equity financing. So they invest in a particular project like energy. Governments give power companies subsidies. So they give them money through uh, those subsidies. People buy the product. Like power companies produce electricity and we subscribe for that service and we pay for that monthly in our electricity bills. Um, Banks and other businesses loan money to projects. Uh, and in some places, they are not charged for doing any harm. So these are the externalized costs of those projects. The cost that doesn't reflect in the financial books of particular power projects. Um, and in a way, what we are doing with finance campaigning is we are looking at all these aspects and finding ways on how we can stop them. Like for governments, we think about them in terms of how do we change a political power to truly represent the interests of people and ecosystems. How do we get those who invest in these power projects to change the place where they invest? Um, how do we ask people to reduce their consumption or to go for alternatives like renewable energy? How do we get banks and other businesses to stop investing or loaning money from dirty energy projects? Or how do we help them arrive at putting up policies or investment portfolios that exclude projects that cause harm to people and the environment? And lastly, how do we change the laws so that uh, corporations that invest in destruction actually are held responsible for the destruction that they bring? And how do we make them pay restitution for communities that they've already harmed or damaged? And in a way, when you think about finance campaigning, it's relatively new. But when I say new, it's like 20 plus years old. So it's still still older than most of you. But it is something important because banks are a huge source of money for the fossil fuel industry. I give here just this figure. 33 private global banks finance fossil fuels with 1.9 trillion US dollars since 2015, since the Paris Agreement was passed. And this is the amount for every succeeding year after 2015. And if you think about uh, a, a million is already a lot, right? But think about a billion and then a trillion. So that's a lot of money. And another thing that you should know about finance is it comes from different banks. And for the sake of this presentation, I just narrowed it down to two types of banks. Like first is there are private banks. These are the banks where you put your savings in. That's probably the more familiar with you. These are the kinds of banks that put out their names in the market. So you also see them in advertisements in television and the newspaper. And they are the ones that have engagement with people directly. Here are just examples of banks that 350 is targeting in our campaigns. BPI, or Bank of the Philippine Islands, is one of the biggest banks in the Philippines. Mizuho is one of the biggest banks in Japan, but actually is financing several projects here in the Philippines. The same with Standard Chartered. bank. They are also funding San Miguel projects here in the Philippines. And then ICBC is the largest private bank that's investing in fossil fuels around the world. It's the Industrial and Commercial Bank of China. Later, I'll share some experiences that we have with these banks. And then there are public banks. These are commonly owned by governments as opposed to private banks that are owned by corporations. Um, and they have some accountability to government officials, which makes them more responsive to public pressure through engagement with government institutions. Um, these are important because if you would look at fossil fuel projects, like let's say a coal plant, this diagram shows the development project of how a coal plant gets constructed. So there's a coal developer. It's the company that plans to set up the power plant. Basically, the coal power developer would go for a power company that would set up the actual facility. They would reach out to the government to seek permits, but they would reach out to communities to get their consent. After they go through that, they would be able to seek financing, like people who would be investing money to make to ensure that the coal power plant gets constructed and gets operating uh, afterwards. And they reach out to two sectors. They reach out to the public sector. These are the government banks. So there's national development banks. There are state banks. There are called multilateral development banks, like the Asian Development Bank and the uh, International Finance Corporation. Then there are export credit agencies. These are import export bank of different governments. And then there are private sector. These are the commercial banks. So they invest, they get secure protection from insurance companies, and then they seek investors from different kinds of institutional investors. Then there would be commercial banks, and then lastly there would be an underwriter. This is the institution that would ensure that they would be purchasing the assets of the bank so that they would be able to pay off their debts. And let's see this development process in an actual project. This is a campaign that we are working on for a coal plant in Atimonan that is currently funded by many different institutions. So the coal developer or the project sponsor is Meralco Powergen or MGen. Um, the coal company is Atimonan One Energy. They are the ones who would be operating the power plant. One investor there is Ayala, and they are investing via underwriting the money coming from the World Bank or the International Finance Corporation. Um, the private banks like BPI is the lead underwriter, and then PNB and Union Bank. Um, Kexim, which is the Korean Export-Import Bank, handles the engineering and procurement of the construction of the power project. Um, and then the people pay for the project via the utility company. So if you would see that it's a web of different institutions as well that relate to the government and to the private banks. So the question is how do we respond to finance campaigning? There are several ways, and I could share some experiences that we had. And I think I'll just shorten it because it's for the interest of time, and I would be more interested in having that discussion with you guys. So I'll be sharing now some experiences that we have with finance campaigning, at least in the Philippines, because I think more of you here in the audiences come from the Philippines. This is the BPI campaign that we are doing, specifically targeting this project, the Atimonan Coal Power Plant, because as you can see, BPI is the lead underwriter. We started the campaign in 2017. The photos come from the initial action that we did when we launched the campaign. And through several engagement and through securing a broader constituency that would be targeting BPI, including the church. And as of April 21, at least in their AGM, and their CEO has expressed an intent to move away from fossil fuel projects by cutting their investments in half by 2026, which is good, but we are still pushing them to do it faster, and to come up with clear indications on which projects they would be cutting down their investments. Um, Next is the campaign that we have been doing with Asian Development Bank. This is a campaign that I've been involved in for almost 16 years. It's actually, before I joined 350, I was part of Greenpeace, and this is one of the first actions that I actually became a part of in 2005. I was part of the campaign of Greenpeace to secure the commitment from the Asian Development Bank to arrive at a new energy policy investment. That's where we were able to get the Clean Energy Fund in 2016. And then now the bank is actually in the process of revising that energy policy that happened in 2009. And it's interesting that the interventions that we have been doing through organizing different communities and through working with organizations that are doing policy level advocacy, we were able to get the most recent energy policy that they released 2 weeks ago says that they will not finance any new coal power facility. However, there's indications there that they would be shifting more in loans for natural gas projects, which is something that we are working towards the bank phasing it out as well. An interesting campaign that I was involved in with 350, this was the first campaign that I did, was to working with the Catholic Church, because the Vatican Bank is one of the biggest government-owned banks in the world. And one of the richest entities in the world as well is the institutions in the world as well is the Roman Catholic Church. And when Pope Francis visited the Philippines in 2015, we launched the Divest the Vatican campaign, and we were able to secure good and establish good networks with the church in the Philippines, together with communities that are affected by the worst impacts of climate change, including the communities that survived Typhoon Haiyan. And as of July 20, actually, the Vatican has already called on Catholics to divest and reform their banks. In the Philippines, there are banks who have there are Catholic institutions and congregations and dioceses that have already divested on particularly harmful projects. And I would say that this is something that's close to securing a clear victory on divestment. As of July 2020, there's still work being done there by much of our colleagues in Europe in 350. And then this is a recent climate work that we are doing, because much of the work we did starting 2019 was to shift our organizational resources towards building youth-led climate campaigns. And one of the things that we did is we were able to establish a good network of youth climate activists in the Philippines. Among them was YACAP, or Youth Advocates for Climate Action, and they were one of the youth climate strike movements that were able to become the Philippine equivalent of Fridays for Future. And they started a campaign targeting Standard Chartered Bank because it puts $1.8 billion onto coal developers in the Philippines, namely Aboitiz and San Miguel. So this is an action that we did last March. And maybe you're familiar with Mitzi. I know she was a speaker in this conference as well. And then last is we also target governments because like JICA and JBIC are publicly funded banks. And when the G20, the group the conference happened in 2019 and Japan was its chair, we called on, together with other organizations. We held actions and secured a lot of media coverage for our to get Japanese financial institutions to divest from fossil fuels and shift investments towards low carbon development. And like last year, Japan announced that they would be going net zero, but that gave a policy hint to many of the Japanese financial institutions and energy companies to move away from supporting coal power generation. And among them was last week was the announcement of banks like Mitsubishi UFJ to start phasing out coal in their investment portfolio. But we have yet to see the clear what do you call this the clear pathway for that to happen. And in my experience, when you engage banks, they often say that it's with they often respond with denial. So they say that it's not a problem because as an institution, they think that they are actually helpful and that they believe finance is very complicated. So it's difficult for people like ordinary people like us to be involved in them. Some would say that investments in fossil fuels is inevitable. It cannot be avoided because they say if they would stop funding it, somehow other will, someone else will fund it. And it's just how the market works. Some of them would say that they are not in the position to usher in that change. They would say they're just the fund manager. It's actually the people who are the shareholders who have the power. So they lack agency in responding to the demand. And some of them would try to divert our attention. They would say that they would highlight the good things that they're, which is fine. But I think that's diverting us from the real issue. And the common responses that activists do would be what you see in the photos on the right, which I think are good because they highlight that there is a need for urgency. They highlight what is at stake and they highlight what should be prioritized. However, in our experience as well, we realize that people are motivated. There are different motivations for people and institutions to respond to our demands. So one thing that we realize is that we are trying to say different. We try to say it differently, and we're saying that if they're funding the problem, actually they can be part of the solution. And that finance is complicated. It's just a matter of getting their priorities right. We say that they are powerful because they influence the direction of how the market responds. So when costs go up for bad projects, it's actually bad for their business. So it's actually makes good business sense to shift away from fossil fuel investments. We say that they have agency because as institutions that steer the direction of how money is being used, they actually are steering or creating the direction for the future, and they have the resources, and that what they're doing are good, but it's small, and they can do better if they want to. And I think the photo as well of making economic in the right is also an aspect that we always want to emphasize is that there is no good economy on a dead planet. This one is a protest that a march that we joined during Labor Day in 2019. And lastly, I say that for 350, we believe that it's also incumbent to emphasize that what we see currently is like the climate crisis is an indicator of a broken system, and the climate crisis is a symptom of a broken system that is basically political and economic in nature. And basically the problem there is that it treats people and ecosystems as a commodity. And the proper response to the crisis is still system change. To be able to do that is that we encourage people that we speak to still strive for a sustainable lifestyle, but at the same time recognize that how little it is, more needs to be done. And a good part of doing that is helping build the movement that is calling for a sustainable and just future. So there is a need to practice sustainable lifestyles, practice energy efficiency, to be more mindful of our diet, to practice zero waste, but at the same time join or hold regular discussions and study sessions on climate change and other social issues and how they relate to one another. There is still that important aspect of engaging in dialogue or in conversation and immersing with the people who are experiencing the most adverse impacts of the climate crisis. They are the people who are oppressed, marginalized, and vulnerable in the current system. And because if we do that, it would actually help inform the kind of climate campaigns that we would be launching so that it would immediately benefit our communities, and at the same time encourage them to participate in activities that would advance the interests of sustainability that is not only grounded on science but actually grounded on justice and equity. And with that, I'd like to end my presentation. If you want to keep in touch, I put in my email address and the website of 350.org, and I'm looking forward to your questions. Thank you.